afternoon and welcome to this regular meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee for Monday, August 27th, 2012. It's now, well, it looks like about 10 minutes after 2. It's hard to tell because the clocks aren't in synchronization in here, but I have 10 minutes after 2. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the Committee. I'm joined by the Honorable Paul Koretz, and I believe at least 2 of our members are en route, but we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to hold the closed session items over towards till the end of the agenda to allow our other colleagues time to join us. If anybody would like to fill out a public comment card on any of today's agenda items or a general public comment card about any matter within the jurisdiction of the council, please feel free to fill out a card and bring it forward. As of this moment, I have none. Mr. Koretz, unless there's an objection, item 4, I think, is suitable as a consent item. It's a regular report on outside council expenditures. And seeing no one rushing for a card, we're going to close public comment. That'll dispose of that item, and then let's proceed with item number 5.
Do you want to take up item 3 towards the end? Item 3 towards the end?
Item 3, I understood we were going to consider in closed session.
Okay.
So we'll save that until the
Wonderful.
end. Items 1, 2, and 3 we'll take out of order at the end of the agenda. We'll start with number 5.
Okay. Item 5 is a CLA report in response to Moset and Cardenas-Wesson relative to the impacts of Assembly Bill 1484, the redevelopment budget trailer bill. Legislation.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Ivania Salvador with the Legislative Analyst Office. Before you today is AB 1484, and this is really the redevelopment budget trailer legislation. As you may recall, when the bill AB 1X26, the redevelopment dissolution bill, when that made its way through the legislature, there were a lot of calls to make technical changes and clarifications to this bill since there was a lot of questions and that bill was written hastily, and different entities requested that this bill be amended to give further clarifications to some of the provisions. What you have before you is sort of a quick overview of AB 1484 and the changes that were made to the redevelopment dissolution bill. Attachment 1 of this report also includes a more detailed summary of the housing provision changes in 1484. Relative to the transfer of the housing assets, as you may recall, the city did elect to become the housing successor entity for the city of LA, and so doing designated LHD to be its representative. There were several questions relating to this issue in the dissolution bill, and as such, the 1484 has clarified those changes. And as such, what ended up resulting in is that the housing successor, which is the city of LA, was required to send a list of all the housing assets to DOF, as well as the bill clarified what those assets would be and set a timeline as to when those assets must be transferred to the DOF for review. Where we are at this point is that on August 1st, LHD provided that list to DOF of the housing assets with the understanding that in as much as LHD is not in possession of these assets, that they did assume the right to, make any changes to that if so needed to this list. Mr. Rush Cervantes from LHD is also here to talk about any particular questions you may have relative to the transfer. Where we are right now is that we have till August 31st for the DOF to come back and give us their approval of this asset transfer list. And then, assuming we agree or not agree on this, we would have an additional 5 days to respond to the DOF. Relative, again, to the housing portion, the assets were defined in this bill, so this made it a little easier to know what the city would keep and or what would may stay with the CRA DLA. Point out that the mixed-use assets, those would remain with the DLA until for further review as to how those may be disposed of in the future. Relative to the low and moderate income housing fund, a new fund will be set up as to all the low income funds will be placed in this fund, and any excess bond proceeds or loan repayments will be kept in this fund, and depending on what that ends up looking for the city of LA, we may or may not have any funds, additional funds for housing. This is probably a report back to the committee. We also believe we'll be coming back to this committee and to council with the transition plan for the whole department relative to these assets, once we know exactly where we will be with DOF's determination. The disposition of property and asset management plan, as you recall, there was some concern about the CRAs and the disillusionment and what would happen to all the properties. AB 1484 actually put a halt to the fire sale of these properties, and as required, they are now long-range asset management plan will now be required, assuming that the DLAs provide a completion, make a determination of sale. In other words, for a long-range asset management plan to be created, the DLA will have to meet certain findings and audits, for that to happen. Once the long-range asset management plan is completed, then it will be decided whether or not these properties will be kept, whether they'll be sold, and or whether they'll be turned over to the city or for governmental purposes. So that was a good change in the bill. Again, another major change, though, that was implemented that may cause some concern is that there were punitive measures that were added to the bill. For example, any failures to make payments will come back to the city, and that was something that we did not expect. Even though the city of LA is not the successor agency for the CRA, some of the penalties will reflect this, will come back to the city of LA and may impact our future tax and sales requests. But again, we're thinking that, we're hoping that the deadlines will be met and that this will not happen. But we're closely monitoring the penalties provision.
Okay. Mr. Gretz.
Yeah, just one question on that last piece, the punitive measures that I guess allow, I think, the state and counties to withhold tax monies due us if the successor agency doesn't return as much as was anticipated. How do we deal with that sort of clawback provision? What way can we avoid getting stuck with that liability?
As I understand, the League of California City is reviewing these penalties, and some cities are actually looking at the constitutionality of this provision, and there may be some legal action relative to this. But at this point, I think our outside counsel is here from Richard, Watson, and Gershon as well to answer that question. But at this point, it looks like the penalties and where they're going to be initiated, that the DLA is adhering to these deadlines. So at this point, out of the 5 penalties, we were looking to, but I can't tell you, maybe our outside counsel can say what would be better.
I'm Robin Harris from Richards Watson, the city's outside counsel on dissolution. There's 2 scenarios where penalties could be applied. One is in connection with the ROPS, which is the schedule that the CRA prepares every 6 months in order to collect money to pay their obligations. There are deadlines for the submission of those schedules to the Department of Finance. And AB 1484 imposes a $10,000 a day civil penalty on the city if the ROPS were submitted late. The ROPS for this upcoming 6-month period is due September 1st with a couple of extra days because of Labor Day. The CRA and the Oversight Board have already considered the ROPS, so we don't have any concern that that ROPS will be submitted on time, but that issue will come up again every 6 months if there isn't litigation that overturns the constitutionality of penalizing the city for the actions of a separate legal entity. The other aspect where there's a penalty that could be opposed against the city is the question that you raised about property transfers. There is a process called a due diligence review, which is for the purpose of looking at the funds of the former redevelopment agency and figuring out how much of those funds are obligated for pre-existing enforceable obligations and how much of the funds are unobligated, meaning that they would be available to get swept to the taxing entities. Part of that review will look at property transfers that occurred between the former redevelopment agency and the city after January 1, 2011. If it's determined that any properties were transferred that should be transferred back, if they're not transferred back, then the value of those properties can be imputed to the unobligated fund balance, meaning a dollar amount for those properties would need to be transferred to the taxing agencies, and if the CRA did not do that, that's where property tax and sales tax offsets could occur against the city. That due diligence review on the non-housing funds is scheduled to be completed in April of 2013. So that at some point after that, the CRA would be notified of the dollar amount that they're expected to remit to the county auditor and controller, who in turn will remit the funds to the taxing entities.
So, given the fact that we're facing the potential of penalties for failure to meet those deadlines and so on, I'm a little concerned that LAHD has not yet received the files from CRA LA on the housing assets. Why is that? If it's been 8 months since the council approved maintaining that that role, so I would have expected that. I can understand that a lot of the transactions will take longer and so on, but at least the transfer of files should have been completed by now, shouldn't it? So that we can start, so LAHD staff can get into the meat of this?
Rushmore Cervantes with the Housing Department. That would have been desirable, but at this point, since the council and mayor made the decision to accept the responsibility of being the housing successor effective February 1st, there has been no exchange of any files of any kind. We've had ongoing dialogue with the former CRA staff to try to work out the details of the transfer. We have a pretty good understanding as to the numbers of files, number of loans, the number of covenants, but as far as getting into the specifics, we don't have access to those as of yet. We've actually physically seen them, but to actually be able to sit down and transfer them up, we have not had that opportunity yet.
But I guess the question is why? I get that maybe the assets couldn't be transferred, but why can't we get a moving van over and pick up the files and take our files? Where is the obstruction in getting that done?
The designated local authority has its own council, and their council have directed them until such time that the actual transfer has been approved by the Oversight Board and ultimately the Department of Finance. They are to retain all files and documents relative to what's housing asset. So that's the direction they're receiving. Ultimately, the way the legislation has been written, it doesn't become effective. The transfer doesn't become effective until such time that those bodies approve it. So that being said, they're unwilling to relinquish those files.
I see. Okay. Okay, thank you. Mr. Englander?
Just a follow-up question from that is, what's the timing on their side?
Right now, it looks as though the next designated local authority meeting is going to be September 20th. We had hoped that we would have had an agreed-upon settlement or an agreed-upon language for the transfer that last week. It did not materialize. We're very close as far as our negotiations between our outside legal counsel as well as their counsel, and just working through the details of actually what's going to transfer, how it transfers, getting into the minutia, as well as any type of settlement agreements that would be associated with the former CRA. That being said, the next scheduled meeting is September 20th. They have to allow thereafter it to go to the oversight board. There's a 10-day noticing, so it could be as late as November before we actually get their oversight board approval. In the interim, once the designated local authority oversight board meets, we anticipate coming before the committee and council with the transition plan that they're looking at, along with the transfer documents, so that we can actually be in sync. So by the time their oversight board approves it, either in first part of October or first part of November, because they only meet once a month now, that we can have concurrence on both parties, and then I can go to the state.
So what is it you need to do when you receive the file? The first question is it all digital, or is it all paper?
It is all paper.
And are you geared up, and do you have a plan in place the day that triggers when you receive the files, and exactly what you need to do to get caught up, and staffing requirements and a timeline and plan to?
We have a small staff that's been hired now that will actually is working with their staff to try to ascertain exactly what it is that's going to be transferred. There may be some electronic portions. I know that they actually store some of their files off-site, so we're developing a plan to transfer both or perhaps even retain the contract for a period of time where they keep their files, as well as transfer those that are active files to the department. So we're working both for the loan portfolio, looking at that, as well as the covenants. There's about 23,000 active covenants that we'll be monitoring, as well as close to 450 loans that we'll have to be managing.
That's what I was going to ask you about the volume and
It's significant. 28,000 total covenants, 23,000 of which are affordable, 450 some odd loans. We're going to be receiving 67 parcels of land that are throughout the city. We've got to go through our due diligence to identify, map them, find out where they are, the condition, and to come up with a plan as to how we want to resolve or deal with each one of those parcels.
some of these are occupied, some of them are not?
We're not certain exactly the state of them. Most of them, as I understand, are vacant land or that could have vacant improvements. We're also going to be receiving bond proceeds. We're going to receive approximately $15.3 million of unallocated bond allocations, as well as we'll receive some small stream of monies from bond administration of approximately $500,000 a year.
And once the transfer is in effect on that day, do we also then do you assume liability for maintenance and responsibility from day one?
That is correct. There's, again, those 67 parcels of land that will immediately assume responsibility of, and then beyond that, there's about 21 projects that are in a acquisition phase to pre-development phase, which those will be transferred to the city as well. And there's no takeout long-term construction or financing at this point. Those are things that the city will have to bring over and try to process through so they begin construction as well.
And are some of these vacant properties developed and vacant, or all just vacant land? Do they have any dwellings on them at all?
That we don't know yet, Councilman. We just received this list, as a matter of fact, about 2 weeks ago. So we're going to go through every single property, map it, determine what's on that land. We have to look at what our exposure is, and come up forth with a plan to the council as to what our recommendations are to how to proceed. Do they fit in line with what the housing department, the city, would like to do on long term?
Would it be appropriate to ask for a copy of any strategic plan or initiatives that you have in place to hit the ground running, that we are just from the exposure of liability? I mean, once we have these properties moved over to the portfolio, then we're going to assume full responsibility, and I can see anything happening at that point. And so to get into a dialogue of, or at least having a copy of what your plan is from day one, in terms of doing your inventories, your on-site checks, if a property needs to be secured, all of those things in place, so we actually have some knowledge of what the plan is
Uh,
day
that's-
one?
That's a valid question, and we can certainly provide that to the committee and council. I think it's important to know what our liabilities are and what our holding costs are associated with that, and also what our longer-term holding plans are. We
Okay.
can provide that for you.
I'll leave that up to the discretion of the chair, but yeah.
No, I
thank you.
think that would be absolutely appropriate, especially given the potential for significant liabilities. We have a little bit of time now to anticipate that, to prepare for it.
Correct.
To do kind of a drive-by analysis of the condition of the properties
Sure.
and, have a plan in place. It would be, I would appreciate having a report back to this committee.
So
at some
provide that.
point, within 30 days, 45 days.
30 days would be sufficient.
That'd be great. All right, anything else, colleagues?
Thank you.
All right, well, HCD received and filed this report. Without objection, it would be the recommendation of this committee to concur with HCD and receive and file the report. So,
Thank you.
thank you. That brings us to item number 6.
Item 6 is the Office of Finance report relative to an update to the accounts receivable citywide improvement initiatives, including the status of implementing Commission on Revenue Efficiency core blueprint for reform of city collections recommendations.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon, Todd Bowie, Office of Finance. And first off, as was mentioned, this is a report back on the status of various accounts receivable related initiatives. Just want to note that this does not cover all of the recommendations of these various bodies. These are just those in which finance has a more direct role or is coordinating or championing some citywide initiatives. And a more comprehensive report was done about a year ago with the remainder of the various initiatives and recommendations were incorporated in that. Those are recommendations that are generally affecting or more directly impacting other departments. And actually one of those is on the agenda today, which is housing's response. So departments have provided responses to various other recommendations, but at this point they haven't been all implemented or carried forward. So we are focusing on a subset of the recommendations here that we're really trying to propel. To date, probably the most progress we've made has been on the reporting side, where we've had some resources provided and focus. We've also, in finance, been able to implement a number of revenue-generating programs, such as the Liens program, moving forward secondary collections, our non-tax amnesty program. So we've been able to do a number of things in-house with the resources that we've been provided. And at this point, now we're moving into more of the policy and procedural best practices that are implementing other departments. We're really trying to propel the universal application of penalty and interest. We're moving forward on the revocation programs. As we had discussed last week here, we're really going to emphasize that and make that a high priority. And we're also continuing to look and try and expand and enhance our current collection programs, including getting more departments to utilize the collection programs in full and also to update our contracts with the collection agencies as well. At this point, we feel that these attacks are a reasonable spectrum for us to attack within our resources, and we also feel that these, without going for additional resources, are probably our better revenue opportunities among the items that are within this checklist. That's not to say that there won't be resource requirements or obstacles amongst the various departments. There tend to be. For instance, implementing interest application could affect various department systems. They may have resource requirements related to making changes to their systems, but we're about to find that out very shortly here. We just had completed a survey of various departments that also include the revocation related stuff, but also penalty interest and some other items. And so now we're using that list, which is a very comprehensive catalog of the various accounts receivables throughout the city to really start to nail down where the opportunities are and to work with departments to move forward. And not all departments are waiting for us to to work with them on that. A number obviously see where it's going and are already starting to take initiative on their own in terms of implementing things like interest application. Fire department, for instance, is already moving forward on that for some of their account types. So, as I mentioned, we have gotten information back from the departments, very comprehensive, and we're looking at that right now, and we're going to be touching off with them very shortly here so we can get the ball rolling on a number of these things. And we're also working very much with the Inspector General on these items as well. And I know he's here today as well and may have additional comments along these lines.
And my first question was actually going to be about how you've coordinated with the Inspector General, so why don't we ask him to come on up. And let me ask that question to both of you. Has this report encompassed a degree of cooperation between the two offices? I know that you have a report still that's going to be upcoming separate from this, but have you had an opportunity to include some of your thoughts into this report at this point?
None. Fernando Campos with the CAO's Office, Inspector General. Currently, my thoughts are not incorporated into the report before you. However, working very closely with the Office of Finance in terms of moving forward. The item, I do want to commend the Office of Finance for moving forward on some of the initiatives. I know this is their second annual report regarding the core recommendations, but there are other departments that have gone out there and implemented some of the other ideas, such as ITA, City Attorneys, Housing, LAPD, Public Works, and Police, and wanted to commend them for their work on what they've done so far. The fire department, as you know, about 2 years ago, they outsourced the ambulance billing services, which has resulted in nearly $10 million net over the last 2 years because of that movement. However, the report before you does have various status indicators. There's 7 indicators out there that range between implemented, completed, submitted, in progress, initiated, pending, and without going through too much detail of the report, if you lump all those that are implemented and completed, about 46% or about 35 of the 76 items before you have been completed. About 42% or about 32 items are still in progress. So it gives you a flavor of where we are. However, it does not give you a comprehensive, as Todd indicated earlier, it does not give you a comprehensive overview of where we are with the core recommendations. Currently, the report is missing about 24 of the core Phase 1 blueprint report. As you know, there is a Phase 2 that is compiled about 8 reports. In total, the core recommendations are close to about 250, 265 items in general. So this report only provides a snapshot, a subset of what the Office of Finance believes their major focus is. However, I am working on a report that will be coming before your body within the next 30 days in terms of the entire comprehension initiatives, which will cover close to 400 items in total. And hopefully at that point would provide a bigger picture of where we are with our accounts receivables and all the recommendations that have been before you through various reports, such as the Controller's Audits Report, the core Phase 1, Phase 2, the Messiah study, and other council motions that have been before you and also being considered by the Office of Finance. Couple of recommendations or some of the areas that I would suggest this committee to consider. And one is instructing departments that have not yet provided a response to the survey. I believe most of the departments have responded to the Office of Finance, but if there is any department out there that has not yet responded or completed the survey, I encourage this committee to instruct those departments to do so immediately. Also, consider amending recommendation number 2 from the Office of Finance to report back to this committee on a semi-annual basis as opposed to an annual basis. My reports before you will be coming on a quarterly basis, so I believe that you'll have a comprehensive overview of where we are and where we're making progress or where we're not making progress. But I believe a more frequent reporting recommendation would be important so that we're aligned and not only that we're reconciling our initiatives and moving forward succinctly and in concert with each other. The last item that I would request consideration is that the Office of Finance and the CAO reconciled some of the initiatives that are before you. As I indicated, 76 items are before you, 24 are missing, 8 initiatives have been indicated as completed or submitted. However, no deliverable or action item has resulted as a response to submitting a report. And so these are the items that I will be working closely with the Office of Finance to make sure that we're moving them forward to the next step, and that we're just not submitting a report, but that we're actually doing an action behind the submission of that report.
I would just note that we did draft this report prior to and release prior to the start of the Inspector General, but as has been noted, we have been discussing on a go-forward basis these very items that the Inspector General has outlined.
Great. Well, I want to applaud you both on the work that you've done so far, and I look forward to getting the additional work product, because this is, we often have commissions, we have controller audits, they come up with ideas, and too often for my tastes, those ideas sit on shelves and don't get acted on. And we have such a sheer volume of suggestions here on improving our process of collections that if we don't have this sort of thorough, detailed reporting process in place, they will get left behind. They'll get lost in the shuffle, and each one of those that gets lost in the shuffle is money that we're not bringing in. So and even if they're not significant, even if they're of minor significance in terms of actual money received, it's critically important for the public's confidence level that they know that we're moving forward and acting on these things. And the only way we can do that is with this kind of detailed reporting. So I want to thank you for that and look forward to getting those reports. I have some substantive questions, but let me first ask Mr. Koretz if you have questions.
Actually, most of what I was going to ask about was already covered, but I'm just wondering, of the 30 or 50 items that are initiated, how lengthy a completion process is it? When do you think everything actually will be implemented of the ones that have already been started?
Honestly, I mean, a lot of this stuff, it's really shades of gray. It kind of depends on what we consider to be implemented. Is it that we got a department to establish a policy? Is it that we got particular departments to actually make a change in their processes? Is it that we have done it, accomplished it for a subset of departments, or on a citywide basis? So it's kind of all of these in some way, shape, or form are kind of an ongoing, continuing process, and there will always be a lot of opportunities for improvement in all these areas. That being said, some of the things that we've picked out here as being the ones that we're really trying to push forward are things that we're trying to accomplish over the course of the next fiscal year, which are to get the pieces in place for a revocation program, to get universal application of penalty and interest, and to really propel the collections programs. Other things are going to be a lot more. Those will have complications, but other things may be even more complicated, especially as we get into kind of that citywide spectrum where all departments are operating independently, siloed, fragmented systems. If we start talking about having a more comprehensive intercept program, for instance, or if we start talking about some of the underlying concepts of the core initiatives, like having a universal payment portal or having other kind of technology-driven types of solutions that may actually resolve a number of the issues that are outlined here, those are going to be a little bit more complex and a little bit more time-consuming and costly to pursue. And that will take involvement of a number of other departments, including the Information Technology Department, especially where we're approaching kind of those citywide technologies.
Well, I recognize some of them are big and complicated steps, but do we have a sense? Are we talking about a year or 3 years or 5 years before we actually take a comprehensive approach to some things that we're doing department by department now?
I think things involving technology will definitely be a multi-year. You'll need time to get things evaluated, do your kind of cost benefits, what is the opportunity here, what's the solution you should pursue, and then get that into the budget, potentially RFP process and then establish a project. So that's likely to be a multi-year approach. In terms of the prioritization of different technological opportunities, there's that aspect as well. For instance, would you move on all fronts at once, or would we kind of roadmap the approach to it and break it into chunks? I would say that to address comprehensively kind of the underpinnings of many of these types of initiatives, that you are looking at, yes, a multi-year approach, at least 2, 3 to 5 years potentially, depending on exactly what the city wants to engage.
Well, and I agree with what I think Councilmember Krikorian sort of alluded to, which is historically, and clearly this is very different, partly because at different times we're much more focused on it, these kinds of ideas would pop up and they'd go nowhere. But I think we're all determined to make sure that they get included in some sort of a strategic plan, and they go forward one by one until it's fully implemented. And at least by coincidence, the three of us here, I expect all to be here long enough to be writing everyone that's involved to make sure it happens.
And Councilman Koretz, I'm glad that you brought that item up in terms of timeline and finding out where our deliverables are going to be met, or when they're going to be met. And so my report will be incorporating the timeline element that you're asking, but I agree with Todd in terms of how long is it going to take us. Those items that are low-hanging fruit that we can quickly move on, we are definitely moving those items. But there are going to be some initiatives that are going to be more comprehensive, and it may take a couple of years to implement. And so those are going to be more of policy decisions that will have to come through your body to make a decision whether we move in that direction or not move in that direction. And if we do move in that direction, to what extent or what magnitude should we implement through initiatives. So we may want to implement an item that gives us 80%, gets us 80% there and gives us a big return on our investment, as opposed to implementing it fully. So those are the items that Todd is discussing, which is aligned with our technology solutions and what do we do with our collections function. And so those items, when it's brought before your body in terms of whether we move in that direction, those could be multi-year items. But the items that are quickly, can be achieved quickly, those items should have a timeline element. And so the next report should include a timeline, and also my report will include that timeline, so that it'll give you an idea as to if we move forward in this direction, here's when we think these initiatives would be completed, and then holding us accountable to making sure that we're delivering those items as estimated or forecasted.
Very good, thank you.
That would be very helpful to have, excuse me, such a timeline. And this committee will look forward to working with you and kind of triaging the suggestions and prioritizing them, and as you say, trying to grab the low-hanging fruit if there is any left. I'm not convinced that there is any, but to the extent that there is, we'll look forward to prioritizing those. There's going to be a lot of intensity in this committee around getting these things done. And we're going to be moving forward as quickly as we can to either implement suggestions, modify them, and then implement them, or reject them and publicly say why we're rejecting them. But we can't go on any longer with having a list out there of ideas that people just don't know whatever happened to those ideas. They're going to be completed, or they're going to be rejected, and we're going to do that in a very public way, so that people know that we're taking these things seriously and we're moving on what we can, and that there's a good reason for not moving on the ones that we can't move on. And I think the public is entitled to that public explanation as well. Mr. Englander.
Yeah, thank you for bringing all this forward, and well, it's easy just to show up to committee and report back. You guys have been working behind the scenes diligently and very focused. And so I appreciate that. I know we all do, because it's overdue. And so I want to recognize all your hard work and effort, your team, and all the staff behind you too. It's not just you two, it's everybody else that's working on this. So I appreciate it. The report, it appears to be, it's about 4 months old now, the one we're looking at. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's from June.
It's from June? Well, the latest seems to be May 1st was the
Oh, in terms of the updates?
I mean,
Yeah.
might have printed it out in June, but I think
Yeah.
the latest update was May 1st.
Yeah, it was
Looking at any
probably
updated
updated in May.
categories, right? Okay, so I think if we can get an updated report on what's happened in the last quarter, or the last 4 months would be great. A couple things that, in terms of the status indicator, there seems to be, I'm not sure if there's different people working off of the same spreadsheet or, and updating it on the status indicator, or what is really considered in progress versus what's truly considered implemented versus what's considered submitted, what's considered complete, and, all your categories, because there seems to be, just from the read of the entire report, a couple things that don't follow the necessary, perhaps the intent of the word, but as an example, got several here, but like item 9, citywide reporting, the status says this minor receivable type will be targeted for inclusion in the fourth quarter reporting for fiscal year 11-12. Well, we've already completed that fiscal year, and it still says pending. Yet there's an update, and so there needs, I think, some more clarification on what that all means.
Yeah, I think in that particular case, it hadn't actually come out yet. That's why it was showing as pending, because we hadn't released the fourth quarter report yet. But your point is definitely duly noted, and I believe actually that's one of the things that also the Inspector General was going to provide a more consistent status indicator.
And then I won't go through all of them because I have notes on a lot of them. Centralized collections is example in number 15. It says initiated, but then the status actually says most systems have established an electronic process for account transfer. So it sounds like you've identified it, you've explored it, you've concurred that most systems already have that process. It should be deemed complete. So yeah, again, going through a lot of that, it's hard to determine where things really might be at. The other thing that I would suggest, a few things, is I appreciate that you brought up the biannual report as opposed to the annual. I made a note of that as well. Actually, my note said FSRs. So what I would suggest is if there's a way to tie this in back to the financial status reports, which are more frequent, more regularized, scheduled and agendized, and more transparent, it might make sense if the chair supports that idea to tie those in. If not, we can certainly have them separate. I'm not wed to that, but it's just
As opposed
an idea.
to reporting an independent report from the
Well,
Office of the Inspector
right, it could be
General.
independent, but attached, do it at the same time so it comes with the FSRs. It wouldn't be part of the FSR. It could just be an
Make sure that they're in concert with each other.
Exactly. It might make sense.
And whether or not it's timed with the FSR, I think is not as critical as having it more frequent. And I think the FSR is just a handy tool to be able to expedite that. But I was thinking, you mentioned semi-annual, I was thinking maybe even quarterly, but I wanted to ask Finance what your thoughts are about that, and, given the...
We'll certainly, comply with the will of the committee. One of the reasons why we were proposing to be less regular is just to, honestly, to reduce part of the workload associated with compiling, and also because the change that occurs is not that significant maybe from 1 month to the next, as it would be over a little bit greater span of time, but we'll certainly comply with whatever the desire is of the committee.
Well, it's my desire that if it's more work than makes sense, and we're not getting the information that's helpful to us, but all we're doing is spinning your wheels to create more paper so it looks like we're doing our job, but it really pulls you off of other work. So no, I think I look to you as you're our experts and you're the ones doing the work. If it makes sense to have it more frequently and it really provides good information, then we should do that. If you're saying and suggesting that it doesn't do that, but it just creates a lot more work, but we don't get anything out of it, but creating more work, then we shouldn't do that. But that's
why I posed the question, although I guess those two things, in my mind, are a little inconsistent. If the pace of change is not so great, then by the same token, the workload in updating the report is not that great either. So,
True, it is just a matter of kind of vetting it out and then obviously sending it through the process. But you will receive probably in September, October, more probably comprehensive report from the Inspector General that will cover these among other recommendations, and then perhaps it would be good then to provide an update on that kind of semi-annual, so you would get then another report in the winter months just prior to the budget process, perhaps?
Yeah, and I also don't want to create redundancy here, too. If both of you are covering much of the same ground, I think that's wasted effort. Let's do this. Let's suggest that we consider more frequent reporting from finance, but let's make, when you bring your report back, can you, by the time you bring your report back, confer with finance, consider the workload issues, the advantages of more frequent reporting, and then when you bring your report back, we'll deal with that issue of frequency of future reports from finance at that time.
Absolutely, absolutely. My reports will be coming out quarterly, and I'm definitely in favor of more frequent reporting simply because the items are not left on the shelf, and then also it holds us accountable, and it moves the items forward. And if things are not moving forward for whatever reason, we need to bring them back to the table and discuss them publicly.
I agree completely, although you're bringing reports back on a quarterly basis,
right.
So you're going to have the opportunity to let us know about that if things are sitting as well. Mr. Englander is not yet done.
Sorry if I,
Sure.
it could be that we submit regularly to the Inspector General for incorporation to his reporting, perhaps,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense.
So, I'd like the two of you to confer about that and then bring back your mutual recommendations when the report comes back from the IG. Okay,
Thank
Mr.
you for
Englander.
that, Mr. Chair. And then, in addition, on the categories for the recommended initiatives, if you could add two columns, one to be a little more clear and consistent on the status indicators that we discussed, but I would add, as a suggestion, if it makes sense, you had indicated some of these are policy items. Perhaps you might want to indicate that with a checkbox or something to say that it's your position that this is a policy item. So it's not something that says implemented or completed or initiated when it's in fact a policy item that we should take up, that you feel, and then maybe we'll ask you your recommendation, or I'm sure we will, and value that. What is your recommendation on that policy item? But at least pull out the ones that you do consider policy items that we should focus on for a policy perspective. And then the other thing I would add is the timeline box of if it is initiated or if it is implemented, what is the timeline? And then some of these might not ever be completed. They might always just be ongoing. So you might want to add an ongoing category as well. But I'll leave that to your expertise.
Sure, no problem.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Englander. I just wanted to ask what the status is of the RFPs regarding collection of sales, business, hotel, and utility taxes, and also what's the status of implementation of the FMS Phase 2?
I believe, to my knowledge, most of the business tax or tax discovery contracts are in place. There may be one that they are still finalizing. I'm sorry, it's not under my direct purview, so I'm not 100% familiar. But to my knowledge, they're all in place, although there may be one that they're finalizing at this point in time. In terms of the FMS Phase 2, which is the centralized accounts receivable reporting. That data warehouse is up and live since May, and so we are collecting daily data now from for a significant portion of the accounts receivable systems throughout the city. The one major exception being the ambulance billings, which were deemed to be precluded by privacy issues.
Okay. All right. So we dealt with the issue of timing of future reports. That was going to be one of my suggestions. I'd like to suggest that we approve the Office of Finance's recommendations with the amendments that Mr. Englander itemized, and also that we direct citywide departments to respond to the department's penalty and interest implementation coordination efforts on a timely basis, and otherwise provide the information requested by finance that hasn't yet been provided to them. That we also add a recommendation to instruct finance to coordinate its reporting with the new Inspector General, and that you bring those thoughts back with your next report. And I think that was all I had to add, so if there's no objection, that will be the recommendation of the committee. So thank you, gentlemen, very much. And that brings us to item 7.
Item 7 is a Housing Department report relative to the department's billing and collections process and the feasibility of using liens and other methods as additional means of collecting on delinquent accounts.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Roya Babazadeh, Housing Department.
Michael Prendergast, Housing Department.
I want to very briefly tell you about the process of the billing and collection in the Housing Department, and then we introduce the study and feasibility of the lien to you. Housing Department issues over 350,000 bills and notices annually and collects over $48 million every year. Our fees pays for administration of our programs and consists of 2 types of fees. We have annual fees that we bill every year, once a year, that consist of RSO fees, rent registration fees, and systematic code enforcement fees, SCEP fees. That includes both of these fees into one bill issued every year. And we have various other fees for different type of inspection programs and different services that are provided throughout the year that we bill every day throughout the year. The annual bill, systematic code enforcement and RSO fees consist over 83% of our revenue. And we do have excellent rate of collection for original RSO fees and SCEP fees, which is 93% and 94% for our regular fees. Other fees, total together, we have over 90% collection for our regular fees. We have very high penalties attached to non-payment or non-timely payment of the fees, which works very effectively in encouraging property owners to pay their original fees, but at the same time they feel hesitant to pay very high 100% to 400% penalties that we charge. Therefore, our rate of collection for penalties is a little over 47%. The process that we go through to issue the bills, annual bills, 120,000 to 130,000 bills are issued by end of December every year. Property owners have 60 days to make these payments timely. If it's not paid timely, by March 1st, the penalties are assessed automatically, and then we send the second notice to the property owners that if they have any objection to the fees or the bill, they can contest. If still non-payment is the issue, we send the third notice, which is, we call it 10 days notice, provide property owners with additional time, 10 days to pay their payments. If payments are not made, then we refer the accounts with remaining balances to first collection agency. Collection agency has 1 year to collect the fees. If it's not made, the accounts are retrieved, and then we forward those accounts to the second collection agency. The generic bills that are issued daily have very much the same process, with the difference that property owners have to begin with 30 days to make the payments. As you see, there is ample time provided to property owners to make their payment timely and to be notified about their penalties if they have any issues to resolve. If any objection is submitted to the department, we halt this process, suspend the account, administratively review the issue, and based on the documents provided to the department and applicable laws, we make a determination if they are subject to the fees or not. With this extensive process in place, we still have accounts and property owners that habitually are not paying the fees timely. And based on your instruction, we conducted 2 surveys, one of 7 departments in the city that to analyze if they have lien process. And we also conducted a survey of 17 cities nationwide to see if the lien is being utilized as a collection tools and what is the process in different cities. Michael Prendergast is going to talk to you about the practice in the city.
Thank you. We took a look at the different lien processes available that the other departments are using, and then the 3 main types was indirect assessment. Indirect assessment means that notice is put on title of outstanding fees. That indirect assessment notice will stay on the property title, could be for several years until the property is sold or refinanced, and on that. The other type we looked at, Office of Finance recently began their program, which is a general lien program, but it's nothing to do with the property. It actually goes to the bank accounts of the business that they want to put the lien on. The third type that we looked at, which we found to be very successful, was a direct lien program. And the direct lien program is a direct assessment whereby it goes on the property tax bill each year as one of the line items on there. The LA County Assessor's Office collects those fees and then directly pays the city the outstanding money. The main program that seemed to be most successful and best practice was the Department of Building and Safety that are utilizing this program very successfully and running between around a 75% collection rate on that.
Mr. Englander?
Just on that one question, I've got several questions, but on the one point you just made, when did Building Safety start implementing the change in the program on their side?
Implementing the change, sir?
You said that they've been successful.
Oh, yes, that's correct. They've had this in place, I believe, for about 5 years, their lien program.
5 years?
Yes.
When they implemented what you're proposing to do?
Yes, and they've been building on it. As they started off as a pilot, it seemed to be very successful, and so now they have a full-fledged program in place on that.
And my understanding is they utilized all internal staff. They didn't expand their staffing to implement the changes.
I'm not sure about additional staff. I believe they have about 3 part-time or 4 part-time staff that they use in different sections on that.
I'll go back to that. Okay. Thank you.
Did you have?
I've completed my
Okay.
information on that. That's his questions.
Great.
So I know we've been asking LAHT to research and look into ways to collect more of the smaller liens, and I appreciate you doing that. So my understanding is that you're now looking to use a threshold of $1,000, and that would result in, instead of trying to go after over 15,000 properties, a more bite-sized number of a little over 2,000, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yes, it's based on our assessment, it's going to be 2,620 properties. As you mentioned, you requested this. We prepared our analysis earlier, but then we received authorization to have a fee increase. We rerun our analysis based on the new revenue, and we came up with a less number of property. I guess the fee increase worked nicely for our collection. The reason that we want to reduce the numbers from 15,700 to 2,600 is that we are required to provide property owners with the basic due process of having public hearing. And the public hearing for building and safety is being conducted through council hearing. And we believe that having 15,700 hearings is not impossible. It's not possible for council hearings to conduct that many. Therefore, reducing the numbers by having a threshold of 1,000 seems to be more reasonable. That reduces the number of hearing to 18 or 19 per session of each council hearing.
And it's obviously much more cost-effective by limiting it to only the larger amounts that are over
Right.
$1,000.
Right.
So I wonder if you can give us an update in a year after this process has had a chance to go into effect, and give us a chance to revisit the $1,000 number and see whether that turns out to be a practical number, whether it's actually too low, which is possible, because still 24 or 2,600 hearings is quite a bite, or whether we might even go lower. It depends on what the result is. So I would just ask that we ask them to come back in a year and give us an update. But otherwise, I'm very pleased that this is going forward, and I know we're estimating that I'm having trouble with this new phone. It keeps doing things it's not supposed to do. But hopefully we bring in $3 or $4 million as a result of this, and we'll be very pleased with this program. So,
Councilmember Koretz, I want to be clear on one item. We did analyze the building and safety process, and we ran that with city attorney, and they are supporting that program. However, because of the differences between our department billing and building and safety, number of bills that they have is very limited. We have much larger number of bills and dollar amount, and we have multiple bills applying to each property during 1 year. Our recommendation is to go partial with that process, which means we can add our bills to the property tax bill by sending that to the county assessor's office. And that is a very good enforcement to get more money coming to the department, to the city. However, filing a lien after that might be an issue for housing department bills because the fluidity of the account. Once we file the lien against the property title, the dollar amount of the lien changes very often. Property profile, billing profile of one property shows multiple bills in 1 year, and if it's not paid, we have to constantly update the lien, and it appears to be not effective process. So our proposal is that to go with a limited part of the building and safety program, which is just adding our bills to the county assessor's tax bill.
yeah, I think that sounds like a very effective way to do it. I can't think of an easier way to get compliance than for it to be on someone's bill. I'd say it's pretty unusual for them to pick and choose and only pay part of an assessor's bill. So I suspect this will be a very effective method.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. Mr. Englander.
Just a few questions, but going back to the assessment issue, putting it on the county bill, does the county charge or take a percentage or fee of that as well, or administrative fee?
There is an administrative fee.
Yeah. There are some in fees in, I believe it's attachment 5, council member, that identifies those. They don't take a percentage of the fees that we are charging. They have a setup fee, and then the data file that we submit to them is they charge $50 for the assessment fee and 25 cents for each APN, which each parcel that has a outstanding fee that they're going to be added to that.
And we pay that whether they end up collecting it or not, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
So what we'd have to do is have some kind of estimate of what the net value would be on going down that road. In other words, if we're only collecting perhaps 47%, according to your report, of those ones that are delinquent and have fees, once we've exhausted the internal process, then we've also added, and post-collection, then we've gone to the assessment structure, that percentage is going to really dwindle. So some type of analysis on, or projection on what is it we it will cost, I mean, it could end up
Yeah.
costing us money in the long run.
Yes, on the attachment 5, so we went ahead and identified that the cost of adding direct assessment on property taxes of the 26,000 parcels would be $134,000.
So, yeah, and that's my point, is does it make sense to chase good money after bad? And so the question is, you know, if those end up going delinquency from the county assessor, and while we have a lien, we would be a second, third, or fourth lien holder. At that point, it's mildly interesting on a property that's upside down. We'll never see the money. So the question is, are we taking a risk? And I think we probably need a CAO assessment of that. Has anybody else done it that way? And what's that yielded, is my first question. But the other issue or questions that I had on the report was trying to identify, if you had stated we generate about 350,000 actual bills and notices annually, and the rate for regular fee and collection was 90% returned, and then on the delinquency fees, that reduces down to about 47%. Is that off the 47% off the 350,000, or 47% of what is actually considered delinquent is actually then paid?
The calculation is based on delinquent account, not based on total account. Those accounts that we collect revenue are set aside, and just calculation is based on 15,600 properties that are not making the payment timely.
So that would be about $12 million in total delinquency, and then we're getting about $5 million.
12 million are total dollar amount assessed for those 15,000 based on the new fees in place.
The 12 million's currently what's delinquent. We have $12 million in delinquent accounts.
That are not going to go to collection agency. Instead of going to collection agency, are going to go through this process. Yes. And we expect that 75% collection is going to be coming as extra revenue.
So I think that's conservative. A little more optimistic in the other direction. If you anticipate that we'd get about 75% of the dollars that would go through this new process through the assessment, but if they're already delinquent to us, then there's probably a great chance that they would be delinquent to their property tax bill. So I'm not following the logic.
Our expectation is that because property tax has a lot more enforcement than our property tax bill has greater enforcement and for payment than our bills, we are going to encounter additional revenue. And the assessment of 12 million is based on the total that we have, and then we reduce it to 9.2 million when we have a threshold in place. And with the all costs taken into account, all costs to the department taken into account with additional resources that we need to implement this program, and the cost of the county assessors' charges, we expect to see 3.7 million additional revenue. That excludes or precludes the cost of other departments to process this work, such as city clerk for conducting
So there's going to be, okay, I didn't realize there's also maybe perhaps some other costs from other departments as well.
It is, and one of the requests for authorization is to assess other departments' costs, such as council costs and city clerk costs for conducting the hearing.
If I may also add, Councilmember, that when we did look at building and safety, their fees also are delinquent. They've gone through the process of submitting notices, and the property owners failed to pay those fees. 75% return on going through the direct assessment was taken. We looked at building and safety. That is what their success rate is, despite those accounts being delinquent.
Okay, and just, and I don't want to take the all afternoon on this. I've got a lot of questions on it, but and we can meet offline as well if that helps. But I think we need some some third-party analysis on this, but on the 350,000 bills that we're sending out now, what is that for?
They're for various fees, such as skip fees, RSO rent registration fees, for other inspection programs, such as complaint inspection, general, and RIP bills and legal bills, and various programs such as urgent repair bills, TRIP, tenant relocation inspection fees that the department administers.
And these, because the collection rates just seem beyond the norm, the ones that fall into delinquency and failure to collect seem much higher than any department that I can remember examining. So, but I'll go ahead and hold my questions and see what the committee ends up deciding.
Well, if I can make that process a little bit easier, I think, let me just say that I really appreciate the kind of thinking that's reflected in this report and the effort that you've put into trying to think in new ways of creating greater efficiencies, and I appreciate that. I don't feel prepared to be able to assess the cost benefits of this proposal, and particularly the new positions as I sit here. What I would like to do is instruct the CAO and the CLA to review the proposal, particularly with regard to its staffing requirements and the cost-benefit assumptions that are contained in it. And then we'll hold it in the committee until we get a report back from the CAO and CLA. I think 2 weeks is sufficient for that, or 30 days?
It will be, say, 30 days. We'll try to get it sooner, though. We don't want to hold this up.
Let's go ahead and ask that the CAO and CLA report back within 30 days on their assessment of housing's proposal, and we'll have greater opportunity then to consider some of these questions and others when we have the benefit of their report back as well. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Without objection, that will be the action of the committee. Now, I'm told that while I had planned to hear item number 3 in closed session, we're going to go ahead and hear that matter before we go into closed session. So why don't we go to that item next?
So item 3 was continued from February 22nd, 2012. It's the Office of Finance report relative to approval of a refund claim in the amount of $245,510.28 filed by Next Century Associates, LLC.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Elizabeth Salamides from Office of Finance. We're actually recommending approval of the refund claim filed by Next Century Associates for $245,510.28. It's based on a board of review. It was actually based on a board of review that resulted with refund.
So I'd like you to walk me through how the discrepancy developed, because the previous audit had a different assumption about the scope of the TOT than the Board of Review ultimately concluded. And it strikes me that that should be a legal issue that seems kind of black letter to me. So I'm wondering how it is that discrepancy evolved, and how is it that it was changed? Is there something you can tell us about that in?
Maybe I can bring some clarity to this issue. Valentin Dinu, City Attorney's Office. This whole issue initially arose out of an audit from the Office of Finance, which assessed additional transient occupancy taxes on a specific category of charges made by this particular hotel, and that was attrition and cancellation charges. Now, it's my understanding...
So before you go any further, let me make sure I understand what that is. So that's when someone doesn't show up for their reservation. They're not charged for the room, but they are charged some portion of that as a cancellation penalty. Is that what we're talking about?
Correct. there are the two types. One is cancellation, obviously, as the name implies. The individual cancels the reservation and pays a certain amount of money in lieu of paying the entire liability under the contract that he signed with the hotel. Attrition is a little different. It deals with the fees charged to conventions mostly, where they book like a whole bunch of rooms at the same time, and it turns out that they don't need all of them. And in lieu of the hotel maybe trying to collect on the entire number of rooms, the rent on the entire number of rooms that was initially booked, they agree to take less. And that is usually spelled out in the contract between the hotel and the businesses. And it is my understanding, and finance can address this with more clarity, that before this audit, the Office of Finance didn't really include those two types of charges in the tax base for the transient occupancy taxes. And they started doing it. They basically expanded the tax base. It's the same tax, but they expanded the tax base to include the attrition and cancellation charges. And, the hotel obviously disputed the additional charge of $240,000. And they went through the administrative process. They went to what's called an assessment review officer hearing that approved the audit results. And then it went before the Board of Review. The Board of Tax Review, as you know, is the entity within the Office of Finance that hears the final appeal from this kind of assessments. The Board of Tax Review asked the City Attorney's Office whether or not the cancellation and attrition charges should be included in the rent base. And we said, yes. We didn't have a tremendously strong feeling that they necessarily fall on one side or the other. But in the end, after our analysis, we felt that they are a replacement for rent. The board disagreed with our advice, and two of the board members voted to disallow the audit results, and that led to the current refund claim.
So is it still the position of the city attorney's office that these categories should be subject to the tax?
We looked at it again carefully after the board made its decision, and we felt at that point that the board's decision would create an issue, an equal protection issue for future cases if the Office of Finance continues to include these two types of charges in the tax base. So at that point, we basically advised them to follow the board's decision. As I said earlier, it wasn't so clear-cut on one side or the other. In the end, we initially felt that they should have been included in the tax base, in other words, as a substitute for rent. But after the board issues its decision, at that point it was final, and we felt that basically equal protection probably will create issues in the future, and therefore we advised the Office of Finance to follow the board's decision and exclude them from the audit.
But I guess that, for me, that's kind of putting the cart before the horse, because yes, I'm concerned that there's equal protection issues. I'm concerned whether this will be a precedent for other hotels to make similar claims. But that's secondary to the issue of whether it's correct or not. Because if we are correct in charging this tax, then I want to vote this refund down and not set that precedent. On the other hand, if it is our legal position that we're not entitled to this tax, then that should guide our decision-making here. You're certainly right that there should not be a differential treatment between this hotel and others. But I want to know, what's our obligation in the first place? Mr. Kretz.
Point of information, is there any reason why, since I think this does have potential legal implications and potential legal actions that could be taken against the city, why this is being discussed in open session?
I'd like to ask our city attorney to comment on whether it's appropriate or not to consider this further in closed session.
Mr. Deneau and I, Dean O'Connell, Deputy City Attorney, Mr. Deneau and I discussed this, and refund claims normally are administrative or legislative matters, and the advice our office gave regarding the legality of the refund claim, it possibly could be in closed session as it is agendized now under a litigation closed session 54956.9A. I didn't feel comfortable discussing this under this code section. So it's possible a further discussion could be agendized in the future under...
I'm going to continue the matter until next week, and we'll agendize it in an appropriate way so that we can have a discussion about the legal liability that the city may be exposed to depending on the interpretation of the cancellation and attrition matters. So let's go ahead and, is there any reason that this is so time sensitive that it can't be held over for a week?
It is accruing an $8 a day interest, just for the record.
It does accrue
I think it's
interest.
worth the investment of $8 a day. So, actually, it'll have to be 2 weeks, I guess, because next Monday is Labor Day. But if none of you has a particularly vociferous objection to that, I think I'd feel a lot more comfortable being able to have a broader discussion about the potential liability that might arise out of the action that we take here. So, one way or the other. So, without objection, that will be the action of this committee. We'll hold this matter over for 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, then that will take us to our close.
Yeah, but before we go into closed session, Mr. Englander, we had considered item number 4 as a consent candidate. It's our regular report relative to the citywide outside council expenditures. Unless you would like that matter to be heard, we're going to consider it on consent, but since you're here now and we have a quorum, we can vote on it and report it out as well.
Is that just as a note and file?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So that will be the action of the committee. And that completes our open session matters. We have already closed general public comment. I have received no comment cards on the closed session matters. So public comment on those matters is now closed as well. And we will proceed now to closed session. Return to open session.
We have no other items. This is...
All right. We have concluded our closed session. We have no other items before us, and so we are adjourned.